Great pleasure and delight to introduce the philosopher, Professor Anthony Grayling, to this Humanistically Speaking's first recorded online interview to discuss his latest fascinating book, The Good State, that I have here. And some of you lucky people are going to win copies of it for free, although it's worth a lot more than the £17 that it's asked for. Anyway, in addition to being the Master of the New College of Humanities and Professor of Philosophy at UCL and Supernumerary Fellow of St Anne's College, Oxford, Anthony is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, the Royal Society of Literature, a columnist for The Guardian and Times newspapers and Prospect magazine, an Honorary Associate of the Secular Society, Patron of Dignity in Dying, and Vice President of Humanists UK, and the list goes on. And in his spare time, he has over 30 books to his credit. So I have to ask, Professor, where on earth do you find the time to do all this in one lifetime?
I don't know. I think enthusiasm creates time, you know. And in any case, we professional philosophers are in a position to tell you that there's no such thing as time, only experience. And so if you're enjoying yourself as you are when you're writing a book, you kind of manufacture it. By the way, if I may, David, just very briefly, I'm not a professor of philosophy at UCL, University College, but
Right.
at the New College of the Humanities, NCH, just to get those little tweets.
Right. Thank you for the correction, and apologies for that, Anthony. Right. You claim in your book that politics is too often the enemy of government, at least of good government. Can you explain that a little further? What do you think are the main difficulties between politics and democracy?
Well, political debate is about the direction of travel for public policy, for management of the economy, for defense of the realm, for providing the services such as education, health, welfare, which a society needs in order to nourish itself and look after itself. And these debates, of course, tend to fall into opposing sides, not always just two. They can sometimes be more than that, obviously. So disagreements about just exactly what ought to happen. But government is a service for all the people, not just for people on one or other side of some argument. And what happens in a political system such as the one we have, with first past the post voting, which really is a very serious impediment to good government, because it produces two-party politics, and the two parties vie with one another to get their hands on the levers of power so that they can get their opposing agendas through in service to those who have supported them. And the logic of that, of course, therefore, is that they are not really interested in serving all the people, but serving mainly the people who will re-elect them. And this is one reason why, especially if you have an electoral system like the first past the post system, you can get a government elected on a minority of the votes, such as the one that we have now, and such as we almost always have, carrying out policies which are manifestly not in the interests of everybody. And so it's in this sense in which I think that although political debate is important, we do have to discuss with one another, and we do have to put arguments, we do have to criticize. But once this has happened, if we had a more proportional, a more representative system for populating Parliament, so that the preferences and choices of the community at large are represented there, forcing the politicians to start discussing how they're going to compromise, how they're going to work together, how they're going to have a coalition, the likelihood is that the outcome will be government for everybody or almost everybody, rather than just for a partisan side of the argument. Now, let me just say, I don't want to go on too long before your next question, but let me just say, nothing in our world outside Basingstoke is perfect. Therefore, we have to accept that government, like indeed political processes everywhere, are always going to be compromises and are not going to be perfect. But they can be much less imperfect than they are either in the United Kingdom with its awful electoral system, or indeed in the United States, which has the same electoral system and the same problem, the same two-party polarization, which in the case of the United States has almost collapsed into civil war.
Mm. Yes, I really like your idea that there's no such thing as a majority, only temporary coalitions of minorities with respect to a given issue.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's quite profound, actually, because everyone has their own points of view and that everyone's a minority. And I haven't missed your point about everything being perfect in Basingstoke. You must know this place very well, Anthony. Although I have to say that our MP actually became a Brexiteer when she started out being a Remainer, which I wasn't impressed with at all. But there you go. So there is a difference between true democracy, I hope, and what I call the tyranny of the majority. And I certainly agree with that. But was this the main thought that motivated you to publish your book? I mean, this is, it seems to me a little bit unusual book for you to write. Was it an act of passion that you feel so strongly about it?
Yes, very much so. And let me come to that in just one moment, because I would like to comment, in fact, on your MP starting as a Remainer, becoming a Brexiter. That also, the fact that your political principles and what you believe to be genuinely in the best interest of your country is very flexible in the wind of political exigency. So your career in the party and your prospect of becoming a minister and so on depends on you towing the line and obeying the whips. And therefore you act in the party interest instead of in the interest of the country or your constituents. And that is that is another one of the malign effects of the political system that we have. And indeed, as you perhaps can already hear the note registering in my voice, this is a matter of passion. I was deeply and profoundly shocked by the events of 2016, the Brexit referendum and the Trump election in the United States. As obviously, something has gone very badly wrong in two systems which prided themselves on being democracies. I mean, you know, one of the startling things about the United States of America today is that everybody on all sides of the arguments are invoking the name of democracy and how passionate America is about democracy and how much it matters, and they're the great shining beacon on the democratic hill and so forth. And it's a manifestly undemocratic system, and the details of that, you know, demonstrable, I can prove in a moment. This is not just you know, ranting. We here in the United Kingdom had a referendum which was advisory only. Now, you can go online, you can look at House of Commons briefing paper 07212, published on the 3rd of June 2015, which was a briefing paper for MPs who were going to debate in a fortnight the bill for the referendum. And that briefing paper points out to MPs that the referendum is advisory. In terms, it says this doesn't bind Parliament or government. In the event on the 23rd of June 2016, 37% of the franchise that was given the vote for the referendum, and I use those terms advisedly because 3 groups of people were excluded on purpose: 16, 17-year-olds, British expats living abroad who've been abroad for a certain length of time, and citizens of other EU countries who live and pay their taxes in the UK. These 3 constituencies of people, numbering just the British citizens who weren't given the vote, numbering in excess of 4 million people, excluded from the franchise. So on the basis of that limited general election franchise, 37% of the total electorate voted to leave. Now, in no mature constitutional arrangement is that nearly enough for a huge major constitutional change. And yet, the government of the day and the opposition of the day not only accepted the result as binding and mandating, because in terms of actual votes cast, it happened to be 51.89%, but they did not even discuss whether or not a vote of 37% of the electorate should be directing government policy. It was never debated, has never been debated in our parliament, whether or not the advice of the advisory referendum should be taken. And the shock to the system of that made me write a book called Democracy and Its Crisis, in which I talked about where the idea of democracy comes from, how the idea of representative democracy had developed from the 17th century up till the 19th century. And then I talked about what had gone wrong in the referendum and the Trump election, and what factors had been influential. And among them, if I may just say, because I think this is tremendously important for thinking about how we go forward, among the factors is the advent of social media and their use for propaganda purposes and for electioneering. The reason I say this is as follows. In every election, especially in two-party systems, and in every referendum, there is one side of the argument and the other side of the argument. Yes, no, in, out, Tory, Labour, Republican, Democratic. The people on these sides of the argument have pretty well made up their minds. They're not going to change them. They don't even bother really to follow the campaigning. But it's the people in between the two groups who either haven't made up their minds or can be persuadable, can be influenced. And so they tend to be targeted. We know every election, every referendum is won on very small margins and very small numbers of people changing their minds. If you can target these people in the gap, you can change the outcome. Now, with the advent of social media, you are able to target the people in the gap with what's called micro-targeting. That is, you can profile them. You collect a huge amount of data from Facebook, and Cambridge Analytica can study it, and then they can point out to you, well, there are these people, there are all these humanists in Basingstoke, and you can, just to them, not to anybody else, but just to them, you can send them some messages about how marvelous it would be if such and such were the case or not the case. Nobody else is seeing these messages, so if they're lying to you, they cannot be called out or challenged. And this happened in a major way in the referendum. It was acknowledged by Dominic Cummings in the public domain. He gave a speech and explained how they did it, how they targeted and spent all their money on that group of people, and they got just enough of a swing to carry the number of actual votes on the day.
But I accept what you say there, Anthony, but when you're talking about micro-targeting, what's the alternative? I mean, are you suggesting that should be stopped? And if so, how? How do we...
Well, it's very, very straightforward. You just make it illegal in political campaigns to micro-target. That the messaging must be public, so anybody can see it. And therefore, if it's got misinformation in it, or lies, or distorted facts, they can be challenged. In fact, that allies itself with another consideration about social media too. You know, we don't want to censor any form of media in advance. We don't want what's called prior constraint, but we want to be able to challenge people who lie, distort, or put dangerous nonsense out there on the internet, like, you know, anti-vaxxers and people like that. And therefore, we should also ban anonymity, because most of the rubbish and hatred and vileness on the internet is there because it's anonymous, and people can't be, you know, without difficulty at any rate, tracked down. So get rid of secrecy and get rid of anonymity, and in that way you can be sure, you're not going to get perfection, but you can be sure of a much more transparent debate.
Because you have been talking about a kind of benchmark, a kind of a truth post that people can check with whatever facts they're told. They can check it against a reliable informer, if you like. And but we need to make sure that that if we had a system like that, that whatever the reliable informer was reliably informed. You know, we need to be sure that that's accurate as well. I mean, there's so much scope for twisting these things around, isn't there?
Yes, I mean that is a serious concern. You know, there have to be sources of reliable information, and it may even be that you know, there should be some sort of like the Public Audit Commission or the prosecution service or something charged with checking facts and making public statements and what have you. And it should perhaps be a legal obligation on newspapers and broadcast media that when they are called out and disagreed with, that they publish as prominently as they published the misinformation in the first place. Anyway,
Yeah.
to finish answering your question, so I wrote that Democracy in its Crisis book in the immediate aftermath in 2017, so in the immediate aftermath. And having done that, I thought to myself, well, I really, and this is something which is kind of instinctive to people with a philosophical interest, so to you and all your listeners as well. I thought I need to dig into this a bit more deeply, and I need to ask myself the question, what is it that we expect of any constitutional and political order which sees itself as democratic? What does that mean? What does the word democracy mean? And if you take it at its simplest, it immediately has simplest and most obvious and direct definition. Demos, the demos, the people, being the final source of authority in a state, and constituting government to serve all the people, the demos as a whole. The minute that you characterize it in that way, you see a number of immediate implications follow. One of which is that the constitution of a government by the voting of the people must genuinely and proportionally represent the choices of the people. In a system like ours, in the first past the post system, you nullify, you invalidate, you make nugatory the preference or the choice of the majority of people in the system. Let me demonstrate this to you. You will know that in the election of 2019, which gave an 80-seat majority to the Conservatives in the House of Commons, that majority was secured on 43% of the number of votes cast. Just 43% of the actual votes cast, representing just 29% of the total electorate, giving 100% of the power to one party because it has a majority in the House of Commons.
I think that's absolutely right.
Now, you can dramatize this even further. Just imagine a constituency with 100 voters, 10 people put themselves forward for election, 8 of them get 10 votes each, 1 gets 9 votes, and 1 gets 11 votes. On our system, the person who gets 11 votes goes to Parliament, and 89 people out of the 100 are completely unrepresented. They have no representation there. That is how our system works, and it has, been defended on the basis of strong government and so on, which is a kind of nonsense, easily demonstrated by the following consideration. Look at what happened in our Parliament between the Theresa May election of 2017 and the Johnson election of 2019. In those 2 years, we had a quote-unquote hung Parliament.
Yeah.
What that meant was that Parliament did what Parliament exists to do, holding the executive to account. Every single thing the executive wanted to do stood or fell on its merits on the floor of the House of Commons. It wasn't just wafted through on an automatic majority of lobby fodder MPs who don't even bother to read the bills. I mean, again, a public demonstration of this is that a 500-page treaty that the Johnson government reached just before Christmas with the European Union was debated and passed in an afternoon in Parliament. There is no way that the majority of MPs had read and scrutinised that document.
That's political engineering, which
Yes.
of its worst kind. But can I just come back to a point that you made about people's right to vote, and making sure that we get 100%, or as near as damn it, people electing? I mean, there are lots of issues, aren't there, Anthony, that, if you mention to the man in the street, you might just get a shrug of the shoulders. You might get, well, I don't really have an opinion. I don't care one way or the other. And if we force people to vote, well, you mentioned this. You talk about it should be compulsory for people to actually vote. It's kind of dangerous. I mean, how can you instill a strong opinion in people when there's a lot of people who don't care one way or another? And what sort of sanctions would you have for people who don't vote? What would you do about that?
Okay. In my view, voting is a civic duty, like paying your taxes and obeying the laws, driving on the left-hand side of the road in the UK, etc. It's a civic duty. You know, we as adult members of the society, benefiting from the society, using the National Health Service, having welfare provision or state pensions, etc., we benefit from membership of the society. We should play our part. And the very, very least that any individual could do is to give some thought to what's being proposed about how the country should be governed, and to turning up on polling day once every few years to do it. It is such a minor thing that it is scandalous that people can ignore it. That's one point. The other point is this: our first past the post system now is so excludes people from the political process that people quite rightly think my vote doesn't make any difference, because in so many cases it doesn't. The majority of votes cast in this country, as I say, 43% elected an 80-seat majority for the Conservatives, which means that 57% of the votes cast have no influence whatever in our country. In that kind of situation, of course, people are not going to be bothered, not going to be interested. But if you knew that your vote, you personally, could make a difference, and it's a difference that could affect you, and that you have a responsibility as a citizen of this country, in just the same way as you have a responsibility to pay your taxes, etc., that would make a difference. And I think people would wake up, and we would get greater participation and greater interest. You know, look, it has been a happy fact for politicians that people don't take notice and do have short memories and don't bother. And you stuck a rosette on a donkey, they would vote for the donkey just because it happens to be that political party. Yeah. They're perfectly happy with that. I mean, look at an outstanding parliamentarian like Dominic Grieve, who was an absolute champion during those 2 years when Parliament was really Parliament, between the May and the Johnson elections. And he was ousted by his Conservative constituency, wherever it is near London, because of entryism. You know, the UKIPers, the Brexit party, took over the local Conservative party, deselected him and put somebody in his place. And had that been a donkey, the blue rosette would have been enough, and you lose an outstanding parliamentarian like Dominic Grieve. I'm not a Conservative myself, but I have a great deal of respect for people like him who really do make a contribution. Now, in a system where people feel that they can make a difference, they will take more interest and they will step up more often.
Right. Okay.
By the way, both Australia and Belgium have compulsory voting.
Yes, I was going to ask you about Australia. How does it work? If somebody doesn't vote in Australia, what happens? Are they fined?
Yes, they have a fine. You can turn up at the polling station and you can destroy your ballot as a protest. It's not voting; it's turning up to vote, so to speak. So you can register your discontent. I mean, I remember once having a debate about this years ago with a young lady, and she said to me, "If two boys ask me out on a date and I don't like either of them, why should I be forced to choose one of them?" You know. Well, I can see that point, but in the ballot in the polling booth anyway, she could just tear up the ballot paper and doesn't have to go out with either of them.
Oh, I take the point. It's a good analogy. Anthony, can I just slightly change the issue? We cannot ignore the things that happened in the USA, and I'm pretty sure you'll have an opinion about that. So what I mean, I was horrified to see what happened. And I think most of the people I know were horrified. But do you have any comment about how that happened? Or maybe I'm asking the obvious question, but, you know, is this a state that could happen in this country, do you think?
Well, one can never say never, you know, about anything. I think we in the United Kingdom, and perhaps especially in England, have become very supine politically. When you see 1 million people marching, as they did, you know, in the EU situation, that's very, very big news. It's very big news, isn't it?
Yeah.
Whereas in France, they tend to get out on the street a bit more often if they're fed up with things, and in a way, we're rather superior. Oh, the French are always having revolutions and we don't, as if that was superior. It's the other way around. We should be jolly side more active than they are. But in the case of the United States, the political polarization in the United States runs so deep. There is such a bitter divide. There is such hatred and misunderstanding between two sides of the argument, especially from the point of view of the Republican Party, because the Republican Party have worked extremely hard at demonizing Democrats and describing them as socialists and communists and this, that, and the other. And if they get into power, then that's the end of everything. The Republicans are going to take out and be shot and so on. I mean, a huge amount of nonsense is spoken about. And so the polarization is very bitter. And Trump has played on that and exacerbated and inflamed it. And I mean, the reason why there were several hundred people storming the Congress building was because he had incited them to do it. This is the utter irresponsibility. And you notice a number of things. Firstly, you notice that Trump was elected on a minority of the popular vote. Hillary Clinton got more votes, over 3 million more votes than he.
That's true.
They have the electoral college system. The electoral college system was invented by no less a person than Alexander Hamilton, now subject of a popular opera. Alexander Hamilton, to ensure that the populace wouldn't elect a demagogue. The United States of America was not founded on democratic principles. In fact, James Madison said that democracy is the vilest imaginable government system. Not even Plato, who was very opposed to democracy, thought it the vilest. He thought tyranny was vile. Democracy was only the second worst system. But anyway, the Electoral College exists to keep out unfit persons. Obviously, that failed. I mean, the whole machinery of election to the White House is a failure. And I mean, look at it like this. They have first past the post voting for the House of Representatives, the lower house of Congress. Therefore, it's two-party. No third party ever gets a look in. And this polarizes and it excludes people and makes people reluctant, thinking that they don't make any difference, because in such a system, they don't. The Senate is a state's house. Every state sends 2 senators, no matter how populous or unpopulous the state is. The result is that the low population, rural, highly conservative Midwestern states of America send as many senators as the populous California and New York states. That gives a permanent conservative bias to the Senate. It's very, very difficult. So it's so unusual for the Senate to have a Democratic majority, as it will have after the 20th of January this year. Then the election to the presidency is through the electoral college system, which twice in the last 20 years has put a minority voted person into the White House, George W. Bush and Trump. And finally, the Supreme Court, which adjudicates the application of the Constitution, is full of political appointees. There is no separation of powers between the Supreme Court of the United States of America and the political process, which is shocking when you think about it, because the Supreme Court of any institution should be completely independent of politics, but it isn't. President Obama, in his last year, in the second term, had a vacancy in the Supreme Court, and Mitch McConnell and the Republican majority in the Senate blocked an appointment. In the weeks running up to the presidential election last year, Mitch McConnell and the Republican majority forced through it very, very fast a right-wing appointee to the Supreme Court, giving it a Republican bias for the next several decades. So, I mean, this is extremely consequential. So you can see that the system in the United States, and by the way, it's there in the book, of course, everything I'm now saying, but I accepted that and I sent that to the New York Times, for which I've from time to time written op-ed pieces, and to the Atlantic magazine and so on. And they didn't want to publish it. They didn't want to publish it because it's sort of too close to the bone in a way.
And of course, I mean, my inclination, on the one hand, is to think, well, that's them, that's America. They do things their way, and it doesn't affect me. But of course, it does affect me, and it affects all of us. What goes on in the United States affects every one of us. So I think it's appropriate that we should make our position clear about what's going on there and what's wrong. I certainly had no idea that every state produced 2 senators, irrespective of the size of the population of the state. Which I think is extraordinary. I had no idea.
Well, you know, America is trapped by its own history. The reason for that arrangement is at the end of the 18th century, when the new United States was being set up, or the states were all equally sort of populous. I mean, you know, New York, for example, a bit more populous than the others, and Pennsylvania, but there wasn't much disparity. And in any case, the state legislatures, which had all been independent countries, they were all independent countries before the US was invented after the war, the Independence War. And they were very leery about giving up their states' rights and their self-determination, and they didn't want to be overwhelmed by a federal government. And this is where that arrangement came from. And they are still locked in it today. Just to give you an example, the Second Amendment gives the right to bear arms, famously, infamously. Well, as you know, the Supreme Court of the United States has debated this issue repeatedly. It came to the view back in the early part of the 20th century that the right to bear arms was a right for militias, not for individuals. Then, much more recently, the new Supreme Court decided it was a right of individuals to bear arms and not just militias. And this is why people can now own any number of Kalashnikovs and assault rifles and the like, okay? Yeah. But the point is that when that amendment, Second Amendment, was passed, the right to bear arms, the arms in question were muzzle-loading muskets and flintlock pistols. Now you try to commit a massacre in a school in America with a muzzle-loading musket and a flintlock pistol, and you're going to have a pretty hard time of it. The fact that they cannot adjust that in the light of new facts and new technologies shows that the Constitution of the United States of America has become Holy Writ, and they're too frightened to touch it. You pointed out in questions that you sent me, well, America has got a written constitution, you think we should have one here. Isn't the American example a very bad example? Well, theirs is an example of an ossified, sclerotic, you know, stuck constitution without a reasonable, mature-minded, sensible way of adapting and evolving a constitution as time goes by, not in answer to temporary current political pressures or fashions, but in a way which is genuinely responsive to the new worlds that keep coming into existence. We, on the other hand, have an uncodified constitution. We've got a constitution. Parts of it exist in statute. A lot of it exists in the form of traditions and conventions and what they call understandings. Somebody has well said, our constitution consists of a set of understandings that nobody understands. And this, of course, is extremely useful for politicians because they can do different things with it on different occasions. Example, the very first referendum ever held in this country was in 1972. Prior to that time, people rightly thought, I mean, you may remember, Churchill asked Clement Attlee in 1945 whether there should be a referendum to see if the coalition wartime government should continue. Attlee said, absolutely not. Referendums are the instrument of dictators and tyrants. That's what gave Hitler his power. We're not going to have referendums here. Mrs. Thatcher was against them too. But in 1972, we had a referendum for the people of Northern Ireland to see if they wanted to join with the rest of Ireland. And they voted no at that time. I think it may have changed now. Yeah. And then we had the referendum on EU membership, 67% voting in favor of EEC membership, you may remember. And then the devolution referendums, and then the proportional representation referendum 2011, and then the EU referendum 2016. Every single one of those referendums should probably be referenda, but now we all say referendums, was held on a different basis. The 1979 devolution referendum in Scotland required a minimum 40% threshold of the total electorate, otherwise devolution would not happen. In the event, it was a 33% of the electorate vote, even though votes cast on the day were in the majority, something like 53%. So devolution didn't happen in 1979. Remember that the 2016 referendum was 37% of the electorate, lower than the normal threshold for things like strikes in public sector trades unions and so on. And Parliament itself has the cheek to demand a 66% vote of all members of the House of Commons if there is to be an election outside the 5-year term of a Parliament. 66%. Why? Because an election could change the government, change the course of the country. Therefore, you need a very high bar, a 66% bar. And yet 37% was enough for an even greater change in the direction of the country. Now, this is an example of how, with an uncodified constitution, governments, politicians can do what the hell they like with it. And that is why we need to codify it so that we can say, these are the duties of elected representatives. This is what a government exists for and what it must do. This is the limits to the powers of individuals and agencies, state and quasi-state quangos and so forth. So there is clarity and consistency. If there were clarity and consistency, every referendum we've had would have been held on the same basis, and people understand what's at stake. They would all of them have a threshold or a supermajority requirement, depending upon the subject matter of the topic, and we would know where we are. But if you play ducks and drakes with what's happening, you can get people in 2016 thought, I'm going to vote leave just to give the government a kicking. I don't like that Cameron fellow. Or I'm going to vote leave because I really do believe that we're going to give a lot more money to the NHS. And in that kind of case, you are playing with fire, because that referendum is not being held and not being treated on the same basis as any other. Do you know what? On the 16th of June 2015, during the debate on the floor of the House of Commons, somebody from the SNP asked the then Minister for Europe, David Lidington, asked him, why is there not a threshold or a supermajority? And Lidington said, because the referendum is only advisory. In 2017, along with a group of other people, I took an action in court on the fact that that the Electoral Commission had found that crimes had been committed by the Leave campaign. They'd overspent and they had colluded, and two different Leave campaigns had worked together and so on. So they were fined by the Electoral Commission. So we went to court and we said, doesn't this show that the outcome of the referendum is unsafe? And the judge in court said, if this had been a mandating or binding referendum officially, it would have to be voided. But it was advisory only. Therefore, there's nothing we can do about it. Now, this is an example of why we need a codified constitution, because there needs to be clarity, there needs to be definiteness. We need to know from occasion to occasion what it is we're doing. It can't just be made up as we go along.
Well, let me ask you a straight question. You've obviously given a lot of thought to this, and if somebody asked you nicely to write a constitution for the UK from scratch, would you do that? Would you be prepared to do the first draft?
Indeed, I would. And in fact, back in 2000, and I think it was 2009, I and a group of other people who were interested in these matters were invited by Gordon Brown to Downing Street to discuss the possibility of a written constitution.
Really?
Yes.
That's really interesting.
And we had a meeting. In fact, the Blair-Brown governments did a lot of constitutional reforms, like setting up the Supreme Court instead of the House of Lords, doing devolution for the devolved regions of the UK. They did a lot, actually, in that line, but piecemeal. And what Gordon Brown wanted to do was to set up a constitutional commission which might publish on the anniversary of Magna Carta, that is a few years after the 2010 election, if Gordon Brown had been returned, a proposal for a codified constitution. There's a difference between a written and a codified constitution, by the way. We have a constitution. It's neither written nor codified. That's the problem. At that meeting, I asked the SPADs, the special advisors of Mr. Brown, who were there, I asked them an opening question. I said to them, when you talk about a written constitution, do you mean writing down the constitution we now have, which would throw up, of course, all the anomalies and so on. For example, the fact that every single body elected in the United Kingdom, except one, is elected on one or another form of PR, even the committees in the House of Commons. But the only body in the United Kingdom that is elected on first past the post is the House of Commons itself. So it's not as though the MPs don't know about proportional representation, because every other elected body, the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Assembly, the Northern Ireland Assembly, the committees of the House of Commons, etc., all of them on a proportional basis. Anyway, so I said, if we write it down, we're going to find lots of anomalies, and there will have to be lots of primary legislation to reconcile the anomalies. Or do you mean that we write a constitution? Are we going to write down what's now, or are we going to write a new one? Mm-hmm. The second is simple, but politically very controversial. The first is very complex, but politically uncontroversial. Which do you mean? And I'm sorry to say that at that point, the SPADs had not considered the difference between those two things. Because had they done so, it would have been very easy to point out the following. You want a written constitution, take the basic law of Germany. The basic law of what had been West Germany was devised under the advice of a bunch of British barristers back in the late 1940s, early 50s. It is one of the best constitutions you could come across. It's modern, it respects civil liberties, it's designed to protect a state against what had happened in Germany just 15, 20 years before. You could remove one or two of the sort of slightly Teutonic elements maybe, but it would be perfect. It wouldn't take very much to do it all.
Presumably this was around about 1950, was it?
Around about 1950, yeah.
Okay, well, there may be a task for you yet to actually complete it. It's a shame that, unfortunately, Gordon Brown, as we know, didn't carry on after 2010, and presumably David Cameron wasn't prepared to take that on board himself.
He most certainly was not. I mean, you can bet your bottom dollar that whatever political party you think of here, there is one that is not at all keen, and that is the Conservative Party, because our system delivers far more years of Conservative government, plays into the hands of the Conservative Party much more than any others. And the Labour Party used to be of the same mind, but you're seeing a very, very slight shift on the electoral front anyway, because Labour has woken up to the fact that it is never, ever again going to form a majority in the House of Commons because it has lost Scotland and it's very unlikely to get Scotland back.
Unless the Scottish Independence Party links together with the Labour Party in support of a change to the Constitution, I suppose.
Well, now this is this indeed is what, if you were to say to me, what do I think should happen next? Then my answer to that is this: all the opposition parties should make common cause on electoral reform. That should be their joint platform for the next election. And as it happens, all the parties other than Labour have agreed to do so already. The Labour Party is fudging and hedging and so on, and you know, we've heard little hints from Keir Starmer that maybe they might be moving in that direction. If they've got any sense, they definitely will, because, as I say, Labour's best hope is to be the lead party in a coalition.
Yeah, sorry, go on.
But the problem for Labour is that it would have to suspend that clause in its constitution, which requires it to field the candidate in every constituency. Because if it does that, it scuppers the chances of other opposition parties winning in a constituency where Labour might divide the vote. So they would have to they'd have to grow up, man up, be mature about this, and stand people down where Greens and Lib Dems and Plaid and SNP have a better chance than they do. And then we can have a proper coalition. You know, just think, if we replicated the last election's numbers, 54% of the electorate voted for Labour, Lib Dem, Green, Plaid, and so on, SNP. And with that kind of a majority, we get electoral reform. And I think the argument that we should be making to everybody now is that this is absolutely necessary. Our system has dragged us into the mire. I mean, we are witnessing the breakup of the union, the diminishing of our economy, huge damage to it. loss of international reputation and influence. I mean, it has been a complete disaster, what has happened. And it is the absolute outcome of the following fact, that with the first past the post system and with minority political parties who are, because they're in a minority, so the Cameron government didn't have a very big majority, you may remember. So a clique, the Eurosceptic clique, the ERG, they could hold a conservative leader to hostage, and it was they who got Cameron to agree to a referendum. So, you know, we need to be protected against that. We need to be protected against cliques, because in systems like ours, we are run by cliques. Our government today is the Leave campaign, the Brexit campaign. Now, squatting in Downing Street is the Leave campaign. Found guilty by the Electoral Commission of wrongdoing in the referendum, not representing a majority of the country, scraping their program through on the basis of just over a third of the electorate. And this is the situation that we're in at the moment. So this is an urgent matter now.
Right. So the key then is to try and influence the Labour Party into linking up with the other organisations.
That is the key.
And they have some work to do. I don't know how Keir Starmer would respond to that, but it's certainly something that needs to be thought about. We need to take some sort of action rather than just talk. There needs to be some sort of action.
There does.
Okay.
David,
there are other...
by the way, David, if I may just add, not only is there a need for some action, but there is an urgent need for some action, because the next election is not more than 3 years away.
Right. Okay. But there are other influences on politicians as well. It's not just, you know, the stresses and strains of inner party cliques. One thing I care a lot about is that there are lots of behind the scenes political pressures on government. I mean, the newspapers we know about, and broadcasters' influence on the electorate is one example, but we also have the expectations of political party donors and professional pressure groups and sinecures that I feel very strongly about. Sinecures described as outside employment for politicians. I mean, should we aim to reduce the influence of these outsiders? And if so, what can be done to ensure that?
Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, if one were to do a complete cleanup of our system, we should ask a number of questions. We should ask, firstly, a question about the whipping system in Parliament, forcing MPs to toe the line and vote whether or not it's in line with their conscience or their beliefs about what's in the best interest of the country, but just to obey the party line. Because in our system at the moment, MPs represent the party line, not their constituents or the country, nearly often enough. That's number one. So how do you deal with the whipping system? You either outlaw it. I don't know whether you know this, by the way, that the Palace of Westminster is out with a number of the employment laws and other laws that govern workplace relations in the United Kingdom. So the fact that whips can bully, blackmail and bribe MPs to do certain things, blackmail them. If you don't vote for us, we're not going to support you at the next election. You're going to lose your job. Bribe them. You'll be a ministerial or parliamentary secretary or something if you vote with us. Persuade, etc. This would be illegal in the workplace and would be a cause for an action in a tribunal or in a court of law. But in Parliament, they are exempt from that. So they can do those sorts of things. So the whipping system is a problem. Should MPs make a career out of being MPs? If you were only elected for one term and weren't allowed to sit for election again, a bit like the American president can't do more than 2 terms. If you were only allowed to sit for 1 or 2 terms, you would be free of the whip's influence. Then you could really just serve your constituents in the country. That's another thought. Stopping MPs from having outside jobs, that's a third thought. I mean, there's far too much malign and hidden pressure on MPs if they have outside jobs. That's another thought.
Corrupt. I think it's absolutely corrupt there.
Yeah. So along with things like, requiring of our newspapers that they only be owned by citizens of this country who live here and pay their taxes here, for example. because the worst of our newspapers, the right-wing press, the Daily Mail, the Express, the Telegraph, are owned by non-doms who live in tax havens and who don't live here and who want to influence and do influence things dreadfully.
Mm.
So, if you were doing a cleanup, you have to look at all these things. But I'm sure that if we took a step by step, if we reformed our electoral system, that's the first thing. That's the key. Reform elections to the House of Commons. And then step by step, other things can follow. Because at the moment, the way we elect our MPs is a tremendous safety lock on a very, very easily corruptible system.
Are you aware of other politicians who agree with you, who stand alongside you?
Yes, on electoral reform and on a number of these other matters. Yes, absolutely. There are plenty of people among in the Green Party, in the Lib Dems, in Labour, in the SNP who think this way. There are even some Conservatives who think this way.
Well, I was speaking just a couple of years ago to a Conservative who admitted he was an atheist. Miracles do happen. There's a bit of a contradiction in terms, but never mind. One thing I wanted to explore with you as well is the question of, well, we've discussed proportional representation, but you also say that the voting age should be reduced. That's the age of suffrage from 18 to 16, I think you said. Mm-hmm. And how do you think, because that system actually works in Scotland, doesn't it?
Yes.
How does it work in Scotland? Is it working well?
I believe that it worked for the Scottish independence referendum of 2014. I don't know that they do it in general elections, but they did invite 16, 17-year-olds to participate in that referendum because their future was very much at stake in the outcome. But then our futures are very much at stake in the outcome of general elections as well. And so my thought is this, that a democracy should be as inclusive as possible. It should include as many people in the process of electing and instituting a government as possible. Yeah. There has to be some cutoff point, and therefore the cutoff point has to be at some reasonable place where you can answer the question, would this person understand what's at issue? Could this person, have explained to them and could understand what's at issue and what the effect of their vote might be? And I think anybody 16, 17, 18 is perfectly capable of that. But I do add that in our secondary education, there should be much more concentration on civics, on what voting is, and what parliament is, what government does, what laws are. And they should have debates in the school, and they should have elections in the school. And then when you get to be 16 and you've got the vote, it's like a kind of political bar mitzvah. You've become a voter, and that should be a big thing, a big important thing. You even maybe get a badge, like in the Boy Scouts.
I'm not hearing you, Anthony. I hope it's getting through. Can you speak again, please? I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. I'm sorry, Anthony. Yeah, please go ahead.
So I was just making the point there that if you were to lower the voting age to 16, you would want some concentration on the significance of being a voter in secondary education. So at school, have voting at school and debates and the importance of being a voter.
So you wouldn't necessarily look for an alternative method of selecting people for suffrage, like a certificate of competence. The reason I'm saying that is because some 16-year-olds are well ready for suffrage that comes their way, but there are some 18-year-olds who are not. But perhaps I'm being selected myself. Who am I to decide whether they should be voting or not?
Well, there are plenty of 40-year-olds or 50-year-olds who are not really competent to have a vote.
But then it becomes a political thing anyway, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So I think when it comes to voting, everybody's got to have a vote unless they are, disqualified by being in prison or being certified insane or something.
Oh, you wouldn't give prisoners the vote?
Well, I think if you've been indicted for a crime and found guilty, that in addition to losing your liberty for a time, there should be some other civic penalties, in my view. I mean, if we're going to, demand of people that they pay a price for having committed crimes, maybe the kind of crime, maybe if it's, if it's violence, murder, grievous bodily harm, things like that. Why should somebody who's committed murder be given a vote? It seems to me that you've really stepped over a mark here, which,
I think the only case for that is for rehabilitation. If someone has committed a murder, maybe they're beyond rehabilitation anyway. They're certainly going to be in prison for an awful long time, aren't they?
Yeah, I'm sure there are plenty of people who commit murders who can be rehabilitated. I mean, the majority of murders tend to be crime passionnel, and within a family and so forth. Yeah. So they can be rehabilitated. But it is a terribly, terribly serious thing to do, to kill somebody or physically harm somebody. And therefore, for a time, maybe, you should be deprived of some of your civic rights.
Anyway, just to come back to the original point, if your ideas were adopted, do you think that would be the end of party politics?
No, I don't. As I said right at the outset, political debate, discussion about what direction the country should go in, what policies we should adopt, how we should manage the economy, and in particular, how we deal with the distributions in society, how we distribute the wealth, the social goods, the opportunities, the benefits of membership of the society. That is very much a political decision, and one that must be discussed and debated and tested. And there must be periodic opportunities to change your mind and to look for a different direction of travel. My point is that if government, and I mean, it's rubbed in our faces day after day after day. If government is about politics, is government about being re-elected again next time? Government is about doing down the opposition. Government is about being the opposition and criticizing the government. If it's just politics, 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 and it's not about really serving the interests of the nation. I mean, look, any rational human being listening to our discussion at the moment, if you were to ask them straight out the question, do you really think that detaching ourselves from our nearest neighbors, biggest market, with all the advantages of the single market and the customs union, and with this tremendous imaginative endeavor of trying to bring peace and progress and cooperation in a continent which has riven itself with wars for centuries, do you think that was a good thing? Because quite frankly, the vast majority of people will say, actually, no. So let's just, throw the light switch and go back to our friends in Brussels and say, look, bad mistake, let's just reset.
Well, certainly I share that.
The only thing that stops us from doing it is politicking, politics.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So given all that you've said, you've been very, very clear about your feelings and your views. Let me ask you, which countries would you say are the closest to the kind of good state democratic system that you have in mind? I mean, are there any countries that you would like to point a finger at and say, well, this country has a workable system that I would approve of and that is closer to what I had in mind?
Well, remember what I said at the very outset, there's nowhere is perfect.
Yes.
It's all just a question of which are the least imperfect. And I would point to pretty well all of our European neighbors, in Western Europe at least. So to Germany, especially, to France, to the Netherlands, to Belgium. Belgium has its demographic and ethnic problems. I would point to New Zealand. And I would say by their fruits, we shall know them. Only have to look at New Zealand and at how they've handled the pandemic crisis there. Had a look at Germany, how they've dealt with theirs. And
the most successful countries with the pandemic are led by women.
Yes, that's true. That's true. But I mean, I'm afraid it's not universal that women, I mean, Imelda Marcos and Don't Cry for Me, Argentina, and
Golda Meir.
Yeah. So, I'm not sure that is a universal. That happens to be true at the moment. You're quite right.
Right, so public regard for politicians, as we've discussed, has declined drastically in our lifetimes, and that's not good for democracy or government. But I think you've actually explained pretty well how public perception of politicians can be improved. I mean, it could hardly be any worse. I mean, I'll be frank with you, my own MP, Maria Miller, was part of the claims scandal that politicians were involved in, with sticking their fingers in too many pies and making too many claims. But one thing I would like to ask you, and this is the last question really, before I give you free rein and ask you if there's anything you want to add. But just to say, I mean, you are a committed humanist, as I am, and it's striking to me how my own politics sometimes dovetails so well with humanist values. And I just wonder if you thought, is there a humanist approach to political and social issues? I mean, is there a humanist viewpoint for most of our social needs and mores? You know, could there be a humanist political party?
Well, in light of the fact that humanism is an ethical outlook, and ethics is about the character of an individual and of a society.
Also the root of the politics.
Yes, absolutely. So in that sense, given that how good government, the good state, should be organized, that is in the humane service of all who are there, of trying to be fair and just in the distributions in that society, aiming to support that society in the development of being peaceful and flourishing, of fostering education, fostering the health and welfare of the populace, fostering its cultural attainments, making opportunities for leisure, honoring things like our family relationships and our communities, putting into the hands of people, individuals, communities, the people themselves, their possibilities for making lives that are good and cooperative. In all those respects, and you see how they all feed into a question of what good government should be in a good society. They are all of them, to that extent, political. They're not partisan or party political. They're just about our general understanding of what makes for human flourishing and the human good. We all know that very, very few of us like to be cold or hungry or alone or in pain or neglected or unjustly treated or excluded from possibilities and opportunities. We know that. That's just a fact about us as human beings and as social animals. And we know that most of us have, you know, a kind of baseline sort of sympathy for people who are suffering or lonely or oppressed in some way. Put all these facts together, and these are very humanistic ethical attitudes, and you see what kind of state a humanist society would create.
Thank you. Thank you. Is there anything else you'd like to add? I mean, I've exhausted almost every one of my questions now. Is there anything you'd like to say or point out?
No, nothing else other than just to say that in just a few minutes' time after we've ceased to talk, I'll be discussing with my editor at One World Publishers when the paperback version of this book, The Good State, is come out, which is at sometime this year, so not too far off.
Well, we'll be issuing the hard copy. I just want to say to anyone who's listening now, if you're interested in current affairs, and especially if you're concerned about the way politics seems to be going in the Western world, I would urge you to get your hands on a copy of this book. I find it thoughtful, inspiring, and somewhat scary, actually, at times. But most important, I think it opens your eyes at least to some of the reasons why our system of politics is flawed, and why what we're meant to treasure as democracy is not really democracy at all, but a collection of minority interests that in the end is not really in the interest of anyone apart from the very few. So I'm happy to say that every Humanistically Speaking subscriber their name will be put in a pot and selected at random to get a free copy of this wonderful book. We can only afford 6, I'm afraid, but that's going to go out. But even if you don't win, it's well worth every penny of the £16.99 it costs to buy it. Or you could even wait for the paperback, but you know, that's waiting a long time. That could be much later in the year. But it will certainly make you think, and perhaps it'll change what you think. But in the meantime, I'd just like to close and say thank you, Professor. Thank you very much. It's a fantastic interview.